Now, when we sort of stop and pause and examine our lives in an honest fashion, we see that often we are caught in what we would call emotional reactivity. And when we're under the sway of these emotions, often we feel driven to say and do things that are not particularly beneficial socially. We say hurtful things, or we say unhelpful things, or these type of things. And the other thing is too, in terms of action, often because of our feelings, what we really need to do that would be best for us, we don't do. And what we need to do, we don't do. And we sometimes do things that definitely are not in our best interest. So either the emotions can make us do things that aren't good for us to do, or they kind of tend to lead us in directions of not doing what we need to do. And as I said before in the first talk, our psychological past is continually being resuscitated or revivified. That means to be made alive again in the form of a certain way of thinking, a certain way of seeing the world, a certain feelings and all that sort of stuff. And it's a determined existence. And it's in the context of this that we normally look at our lives and normally make our major decisions from this context. Now, I want to explain what context means in this sense. When we look at a context, we're looking at the circumstances that form the setting for an idea or an event, and in terms of which this setting is needed, the circumstances need to be looked at in order to really understand the event or the idea and assess its value. Now, I'll give you an example. So, let's imagine that I tell you that this guy ripped open this person's belly. Now, you kind of think, my goodness, that's not a very nice thing to do. So, but what if I told you that the guy that did this did it under enemy fire to a wounded soldier in order to save his life? Suddenly, the action of ripping open someone's belly becomes a very heroic act. Now, so what I mean by this is that the setting or the context determines the meaning. Now, this is very important for us in the study of Vedanta, because we have two fundamental different contexts. We have our personal context from which has been formed in us, this personal context, this personal sense of identity that just constantly it's chopping and changing, it's constantly being resuscitated by present events. That's one context. The other context that is presented in Vedanta is the vision of the scriptures. In other words, the standpoint, particularly with the psychology of the Gita, is that it gives us a standpoint from which to look at our ordinary lives that's objective. So there are two different contexts. My personal context, from which I normally look at my life, and then the context of the scriptures from which I can also look at my life. Now, from my own personal standpoint, what happens to me is going to be, the meaning of it is just going to automatically arise. Yes, that person has done something I don't like, therefore they deserve a piece of my mind. That's just the way it works, because I can't help but what's going to determine the meaning that I give to any circumstance is going to be determined by the context that I look at it. Now, I'll give you a practical example of this. When I first started to talk to Swamini Atma and Prakasananda, she said, the first thing that we need to do in order to live a better life and a happier life, which will prepare us for the Vedantic teaching, is that we have to depend upon the scripture. Now, that sounds to a Westerner, and particularly to me, what do I slavishly obey what the scriptures say? Because I've got a Christian Judaic background, and scriptures basically meant they told you what to do and what not to do. But from a Vedantic perspective, the scripture is like a mother. It actually helps you. It looks after you. It protects you. And there's a particular vision of everyday life, that of how to live and look at everyday life in a certain way that doesn't come from my own personal standpoint. It comes from a different context. It becomes from an objective context, which is a way of seeing which can become active in my life, but it comes from the scripture. Now, as I said before, when I first was told this idea, it was explained to me that people and events never hurt me. They're only instrumental in evoking or making what's already in me surface. It gets revivified. And that I am the problem, and I'm also the solution, but I'm the problem. Now, when I first looked at this, when I first heard this and I listened to it and I began to examine it clearly, and I remember what I said before is that as soon as we start to examine, we use faculties that enable us, that are peculiarly human, to be able to examine and have a look at our life, reflect on our life, to examine it. What happens when we begin to inquire is we start to understand something. Now, this understanding is not an interpretation. In fact, from this personal standpoint, that's always interpretation. We're just looking at an interpretation. That person's a meanie. That's an interpretation. But what I'm talking about here isn't a product of past forces. This is a product of our discrimination. So when I examined this point very, very carefully and pondered over it a great deal, I finally came to an understanding that people and events do not hurt me. What they do is they evoke emotional pain or hurt that's already in me, whether that emotional pain is antagonism, depression, anxiety, irritation, whatever it is. Now notice that this understanding is an entirely different way of seeing events than my personal standpoint. Now, not only have we the faculty to become aware, and we've got the faculty by examining and looking at things, we've come to an understanding, we're also given the faculty of choice to be able to live out that understanding. Now, this is the whole point. You see, once we've assimilated or we've understood something from the teaching, so that we actually can see something clearly, that the fact that people and events don't hurt us, they just simply resuscitate the pain's already in us. We then have a choice. We have to live that understanding out. It's a little bit like what Aristotle said: the more you express, you impress it. What you express, you impress. If we don't live out an understanding that we have gained from our faculty of discrimination, it gets weak and goes away. So we must live it out. Now, here's the rub. Somebody does something you don't like. From your own standpoint, the personal standpoint, they are mean and they're worthy of punishment, and you feel like retaliating, you feel like giving them a piece of your mind, you feel like expressing anger in the form of attack. See, anger in itself is not the problem. It's when we put it into action and we attack. Now, from the standpoint of your own personal standpoint, you cannot help but automatically come to what the situation means. Yes, it means this. They're mean, therefore they deserve something that I should punish them with. But from the standpoint of the scripture, which is a new standpoint, which has enlightened your intellect in the sense that your faculty of discrimination, you've arrived at an understanding that people and events are not hurting you. The whole meaning of the event, when your spouse or someone does something you don't like, you can see that you don't like it, you're having a reaction, but you won't be blaming, because you understand that the upset and the pain belongs to you. Now, This is such an important thing. So you've got two different contexts here. And right in the middle of when you're feeling antagonistic and angry, you can then, the understanding can come to you, and you suddenly find yourself looking at this event from a different standpoint, from a different context. So all I'm saying here is this, is that we're not trying to get rid of the so-called bad context. What we're doing is we're trying to understand our life from a different context and then practice living that out. This is what I'll be going into.